So we've been waiting this morning for some new polling. It's just crossed now from the Washington Post and ABC News. Shows 49% of Americans agree that President Trump should be impeached and removed from office, with 46% disagreeing with that idea. Broken down by party, support for impeachment and removal includes only 12% of Republicans, 47% of independents, and 85% of Democrats. Let's bring in the polling director at the Washington Post, Scott Clement, and the co-founder and publisher of Real Clear Politics, Tom Bevan. Let's start with the Washington Post. And what did you see in those new numbers?
Well, I mean, one thing we've seen is an incredible amount of stability. We did a poll before the public hearings began and found 49% in support, 47% opposed to impeachment. Those attitudes are hardly changed at all. One thing we've had seen is a slight increase in the partisan divide. And what's also interesting is that extends to views to the two basic charges that have been made against Trump, that he improperly pressured Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden and his son, as well as that he obstructed Congress. 49% believe Trump did on both of those accounts, the same percentage who support impeaching and removing him.
So, Joe, if you look at some of these numbers, guys, the recent polling has shown it at about 45% support, 49% who don't support impeachment. So this ticks up a little bit from what we've seen. But the trend, as Scott says, has been that the numbers have held pretty steady through all this.
Yeah, reading from the Post's write-up here, the latest poll also finds that regardless of whether Trump committed an impeachable offense, 49% say he improperly pressured Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden and his son, while 39% say Trump did not do this. I think that's a number that this White House is working for. They're working to debunk how bad it was what they did. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but Tom, it seems they've lost that argument. If you look at the ABC News poll from yesterday, you had a majority of Americans believing that he improperly used his office, and it did an assortment of things that obviously it was a Fox News. I'm sorry, it was a Fox News poll yesterday, and so it seems as if the Democrats have actually made some points when it comes to impeachment. When you talk about the specifics and the abuse of office and some of these other concerns that Democrats and the media have been expressing. But again, those impeachment numbers remain firm. I guess the only difference in most of these polls is you've seen a partisan divide become even more stark and independents breaking a little more in support of impeachment. But the overall number staying at about 50%, 49, 50%.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you're right. In most of these polls show pluralities, if not majorities, think that President Trump did something that was either, unethical, immoral, or possibly illegal. So that's not the issue. The issue is, do people support the impeachment and removal of the president? And we had 4 polls come out yesterday that show opposition to impeachment above support. It crossed the line in our Real Clear Politics average for the first time. So support now is underwater by about a percentage point. And that's moved anywhere from about 2 points to the CNN poll that came out yesterday was an 8-point swing from last month. So pretty significant. And in that poll, interestingly, support among Democrats went from about 90% down to, I think, 77%. But most of the polling is pretty stable, although there has been a move, an increase in the opposition to impeachment in this last round of polling. But again, it's still relatively a 50-50 proposition.
Well, and of course, John Meacham, we've talked about this before, but you look at the numbers that Richard Nixon had throughout most of the Watergate hearings in the 20s and the 30s. It, of course, spiked at the end. Bill Clinton. Support for impeachment for Bill Clinton never got into the 30s. How remarkable it is that many in the White House are celebrating the fact that 1 out of 2 Americans believe that he committed acts that should have him impeached and removed from office.
Yeah, everything's a matter of context, right? So I don't think it's surprising in a hyper-partisan era that we're seeing these numbers reflect essentially a 50-50 nation, a 48-48 nation, which I actually think is a sign of some hope, if you'll bear with me for a second. It means that very few people have to be convinced of the rightness of a given course. Now, there's the opposite of that. It takes a few people to keep us in stasis. But we're really not talking about trying to get to a 90-10 country. We're not a 90-10 country. We are a 48-48 country. And even if you look at presidential elections in the roughly the modern era, they're almost all incredibly close. There are three big exceptions, 1964, 1972, and 1984. And two of those presidents either didn't run for one didn't run for re-election, one left under resignation, and one ran into Iran-Contra. We have an incredibly closely divided nation, and you will never get, if you're on the side of this about the rule of law and the Constitution, and you're about to give up hope because you can't move these numbers, I just say, remember, 34% of America, after Joe McCarthy was censured, according to the Washington Post, actually, approved of Joe McCarthy's witch hunt. And so we have to set a proportionate set of expectations and make the case to people who are being true to the insights of the American Revolution, which was that you should change your mind if the facts dictate it. You shouldn't just pick a team and decide that it doesn't matter what's being said, it matters who's saying it. That's not part of what we're supposed to be doing.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.